This is a map of part of Europe, the eastern and the middle part of Hungary. As you could see, I put it over there with a big red arrow. Budapest is about 150 miles from Vienna, and you see the Danube snaking through, the blue Danube. It crosses around, it passes through at least 10 different countries in Europe. It starts at the Black Forest in Germany, and it dumps out at the very end into the Black Sea. It's about 150 miles to Vienna, so in terms of where we are geographically, it's from here to a little under halfway to LA. And if we had to travel that distance, it's not very much, but back then they didn't have the same mode of transportation that we have today. Very few people had cars, most people had bicycles, they took the train, they took the bus, and sometimes they had horse-drawn carriages and so on. So to travel the 140 miles or the 50 miles from Hungary into Austria, as the refugees did, it took them a little bit of time to get there because naturally a lot of the roads were bombed, buildings were destroyed. And so it was, plus you had to worry about your security in getting through the borders. But I just wanted to show you where it was. Here's the Danube, a nice cruise liner. I don't know how many of you have taken the cruise along the Danube. You have? I haven't. 3 times. How was it? Wonderful.
Viking cruise line, small ship.
Oh, wow, wow. So here we go, all the countries that you see surrounding it. You've got Slovakia, you've got Croatia, Serbia, Romania, you've got Ukraine. All these countries are surrounding it. And the city where I lived was, you see the capital city of Budapest up there in the center, more or less? There's a little happy face underneath it. That's where I went for my scene at the cemetery. And I grew up in Budapest, which is over here. There are 2 dots on top of the O, they're umlauts, which I didn't put in there. Budapest is about 6 miles southwest of Budapest. It's not very far away, so we were able to hear a lot of what happened, a lot of the noise of the revolution and the bombings and so on. So I just wanted to orient you as to where things were in relationship to other countries and so on. In the middle of the night, my parents shook me awake from sleep. They said, get up, get dressed, go have your breakfast. They told me that we were going on a long trip and we were going to the countryside, the far countryside of Erd. It's not on the map, I should have put another happy face there. But that we were going to Erd and we were visiting my grandmother, and I love to travel by train. We had a train station in front of our house, so I love to travel by train and I love to play with animals. And so I had a double treat. I knew I was going to have fun. And my younger sister and I were going to go to my grandmother's. But they never told me that we were never coming back home again. And they never told me that I'd never see my house again. That night occurred over 5 decades ago, and it lasted me for a lifetime. Until one day, I decided to write about the story. So, here we go. The novel is about a young girl who tries to make sense of her world as it's turned upside down and her family ties are ripped apart. It's the story of one girl, one child, one voice, the plight of 200,000 refugees, and the cries of millions that stayed behind. But the story is much more than the story of a child. It's a universal story. It's the plight of humankind. We see countries all over the world right now. All we have to do is open up the television and switch on the radio, open the newspaper. It's all there. It's the quest for freedom. It's the quest for a better life. It's for happiness. It's what's in the Constitution. And as I see the people all around the globe, whether it's Syria or Egypt or Tunisia or Libya, or anywhere else that I've seen, it's such a universal and poignant story. And we all thirst for that, to be happy, to be free. So this is really what Sheila, the story, is about. It's about that. I'd like to revisit that night. The night that we left the small comforts of our home was a humble home. We left without whispering a word to anyone, not even our family and friends, because if we had, we might have put them into harm's way. We didn't want to tell anyone. So when we left, naturally you can, expect that they were all disappointed when they went to our house and no one was home. And We abandoned our loved ones, our close friends, our culture, our language, our identity. Think of what it means to uproot your whole life, living here where you are, to just lift up and go and, let's say, move to China. Move somewhere else, a completely different culture. They had no house, no job, no safety, no security nest, no homeland. Imagine a young couple with 2 small children having only what they have on their backs and being only able to carry only what they could in their hands with the little money they had in their pockets, in the cold, in the dark, in fear. By the way, my mother was smart. She sewed money in the hems of our coats, so in case we were caught, then we would have money in our hems. A lot of people did that. So we were good at hiding things, and I'll tell you why we were hiding things. I'd like to go back a little bit in history so that you can place into what context all my story is about. It has to go back to World War II, when Soviet Russia invaded Hungary and occupied Hungary, and it stayed in Hungary for a very long time. But after 12 years of occupancy, the people woke up and say, hey, enough is enough. Our standard of living is so bad. We can't buy anything. Food was not available. They had to stand in long lines to buy produce or anything, if they could buy anything. Plus, the value of currency had degraded and gone down so much that people had nothing to eat, and they could hardly buy anything, and their salaries were meager. On top of that, Hungary's natural resources, all the resources, raw resources, their oil, their uranium, foodstuff, wheat, anything that they produce was hauled away to Mother Russia. So Hungary had nothing. And on top of that, all of their liberties were stripped away. They had no freedom of speech, of press, of practicing religion. You couldn't practice religion. Even the cardinal, the Catholic cardinal, was arrested, and he was kept in jail for 7 years, and he was tortured because he spoke up against communism and he spoke up for freedom. So little by little, the people's rights were incrementally removed. Another reason why we had the revolution was that it was a dictatorship and people lived in terror. They were, it was run by a police country, and they were called the AVO. They were the Secret Service Police. And they were very clever at extracting information from innocent people through any means, any way that they can or they could. And they were able to, and if you are tortured enough, you'll cave in and confess to anything naturally. And think of all the people that were tortured. The prisons were overflooded for petty crimes because people would maybe take a loaf of bread or something like that. And so paranoia ruled the country. It climbed into people's mind because they had a system called what you call whisperers. Neighbors would whisper falsehoods against other whisperers, and if you worked in a factory of any kind of a labor factory, you were encouraged to report anyone if you suspected even anything. And people willingly did so because they wanted money. They wanted to eat. And so neighbors turned neighbors in, and even families turned families in. And it was very, very harsh. Well, all of this came together, and then one day, the intellectuals, the university students at the technical college, they said enough was enough. Who are these Russians to rule our country? We want them long and gone. So they drew up a petition of 16 demands, along with an elite organization that were called the Petöfi Circle of Poets. And so they drew up a message, and they say that we're going to have a big march, and we're going to broadcast it and put flyers and pamphlets on buildings everywhere. And everybody, slide please. Everybody knew about it all over the countryside. They crossed 6 bridges to get to downtown Budapest. I think there were about 200,000 people that went on different marches in different places in Budapest, and I'll show you where the marches took place. It was a very peaceful march. farmers, peasants, doctors, lawyers, mothers, fathers, grandfathers, even children, school-aged children came. And if they were at school, they said, hey, something big is coming down. At the end of the day, we're going on this march. So here we go. Next slide, please. It was a peaceful march. You could see over here, it's a tapestry of heads, shoulder to shoulder. And they congregated on two strategically places. One was at the Petrofi Circle Square, and the other one was at the BIM statue. Both were revolutionary people that fought and spoke up in the 1848-49 revolution against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Petrofi is Hungary's national poet, and Bem, he was a general who served in the war in 1848-49, and he sided with the Hungarian people, and he's a national hero to Hungary. His statue is there. And on this particular day, they also went to support the Polish workers. And they said, we're going to these two different places. It's all about freedom. They spoke, they recited poems, they sang the anthems, and it was very, very peaceful. So this started around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Next slide, please. Later on, as the day went on, some of the students that marched from the BEM and the Petrofi Square, they marched towards the radio station. It was called Radio Budapest, and it was governed and owned by the communist government. Some of the students marched there. Then there were other students that just went to the radio station. And the idea, the basic idea, was to present their 16 demands, and they wanted it aired on the radio station. And so the radio station was flooded. But inside, it was guarded by AVO Secret Service police and also from the rooftops. And so they taunted these students, and this went on for hours until the late evening. And at first, it kind of looked like the negotiations were going to make some headway and, you know, be able to broadcast it. But it was just for nothing. I think it was just to mislead them. And then another influx of students came into the square, totally unrelated to the university students, and they created a ruckus. And then by then, all negotiations had completely deteriorated. There was no negotiating. And they had one of their students inside the building with the AVO police. They wouldn't release the student. And so the students outside set fires to some police cars. This, of course, got the AVO very upset. And they tried to disperse the crowds with tear gas. And then one thing led to another. There were shootings. They had these spotlights on top of the buildings, and they shot the people down below. And this was in the evening. And by then, the whole country knew what was happening. Word got out. And they had trucks that came in from Csepel with fire and gun and ammunition that they got from prisons or from the soldiers, and they came in to help the civilians because they were killing the civilians in the streets. Next one, please. Well, they stormed the building. They were able to get out the hostage that was held inside. Next one, please. The march went on. They headed down towards the Parliament building. You see that big, beautiful building in the background. And it consists of multiple buildings. I think that there's a Supreme Court building, and there's an agriculture building. And then, next one. So here we are at the square. And again, a tapestry of people, and the Prime Minister speaks to them, and he wants to calm the people down. He was just reinstated as Prime Minister. He wasn't the Prime Minister before. And people were in uproar, and the AVO were surrounding in the buildings, and they were afraid that people were going to storm the Parliament building, and they were going to do the same thing as they did to the radio station. So what they did is they shot into the crowds, and they shot 600 people and let them bleed to death. There were Russian tanks, by the way. This was truly amazing. The Russians, while they were with Hungary for 12 years, they bonded with them, and we got along with them. And they formed a kinship with them. And when the Russian tanks saw what was happening to the civilians, they rifted the guns on their tanks and shot down a whole row of AVO from the top of the Parliament building. But they didn't know that there were other AVOs on the other buildings. Well, the paramedics came in with ambulances and doctors, and the other AVO that were left on the other buildings killed all the paramedics and all the doctors. Well, by then, the crowd was up in an uproar, and they looked at the Russians in their tanks. Please help us, give us your guns, we can't protect ourselves. And this is really amazing. The Russian soldiers in their tanks gave the civilians all their guns. And so between them, the soldiers in their tanks and the civilians, they were able to nail all the AVO and the other buildings down. And so we have the beginnings of the revolution. Next slide, please. Well, the next day, which was the 24th, by then everybody knew that, there was a problem everywhere all over the country. There was a big crowd at the, what you call Felvonulás Square, which is a square where people marched. And it was a big square, kind of like the Tiananmen Square or the Red Square in Russia. Before the communists came in to occupy Hungary, there was a beautiful church. I don't know if it was a cathedral, but it was a big church. They ripped it down, and they made this huge square so that they could have their May Day parades, and if there was this propaganda spiel, that they had a place for the people, and they had to attend these parades. They couldn't not say no. You were reported, and you were in trouble. So they went to the square, and they tried for many hours to get the statue down. It was so heavily constructed that they couldn't pull it down. So finally, these industrial workers came with torches, and they soldered him down by the boots. They hoisted steel cables around his neck, and it took 300 trucks to pull the statue down. The statue is about 24 feet tall. Plus, look at the proportion of the podium to get to the top of the podium. I would think that it was probably about 5 to 6 stories high. Think of the ego it took to put that statue up there. And if you look at the proportion here, look at the head, how big it is. It stands up to this tall. People ripped the whole face apart. Chunks, they sprayed graffiti on it. WC, does anybody need a translation what WC means? Yes, no? Water closet? Yeah. You see that in England everywhere. So revolution was in full force. People were singing. I mean, there's a lot of disruption over here at that square. Next, please. Well, the revolution broke out, and for the next several days, the fighting ensued between the insurgent working class and the increased Roman army with intensity. More tanks were sent in, and there was a lot of fighting.